The wind had a particular meanness to it that day, a dry, gritty spite that lifted the topsoil and threw it in the faces of the righteous. It scoured the paint from the porch post where Lena stood, her back so straight it must have hurt. Tacked to the wood just beside her head was the notice. Its crisp edges fluttered, a pale tongue tasting the ruin in the air. She did not look at the paper. She did not need to. She knew its words by heart, had felt them branding her skin since Silas Blackwood hammered the nail in himself an hour ago. Her hands were clenched at her sides, the knuckles white and stark against the washed-out gray of her dress. She'd made the dress herself, just as she'd made the bread that failed to rise that morning, just as she'd tried to make a life from the dust her father had left her. Below the porch, the town watched. Not all of it, but enough. Mrs. Gable, whose face was a permanent nod of disapproval. The Miller boys, their grins slack and cruel. They stood in the street, a small, shifting cloud of judgment, their murmurs carried on the same wind that harassed the notice. They saw a failure. A woman alone, unable to hold what a man had built. Her chin was high, a desperate, brittle act of war against the pity and the scorn. She focused on a loose stone in the path, making it the anchor of her world. If she could just look at the stone, she would not shatter. Her gaze was a fixed thing, a shield. She felt their eyes on her hair, where the dust had settled like a gray shroud, on the threadbare patch at her elbow, on the tremor she could not still in her hands. Each glance was a physical touch, a violation. They were stripping her down to her shame, right here on the steps of the house where she was born. Silas Blackwood stood apart from them, leaning against his fine horse, arms crossed. He was not looking at her. He was admiring his handiwork, the public ledger of her defeat. He owned the bank, the general store, and soon he would own this patch of earth too. He was a man who collected things. She had stopped praying for rain weeks ago. Now she prayed for a different kind of oblivion. A quiet fading, a wind that would lift her up and scatter her like the dust, leaving nothing behind for them to pick over. The sun beat down, a flat, white heat, and the silence from the porch was louder than all their whispers combined. She was an island and the sea was rising. Then a change in the texture of the afternoon. A new shape appeared at the edge of the road, moving with a slowness that felt deliberate, ancient. It was a man on foot, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went deeper than the road. He carried no horse, just a bedroll and a coat slung over one shoulder despite the heat. Dust clung to him like a second skin, turning his clothes the color of the tired land itself. He did not seem to notice the gathering, or if he did, he gave no sign. He walked with his eyes on the ground ahead, one footfall after another, a rhythm of pure endurance. As he drew closer, details swam into focus, boots worn through at the sole, hands chapped and raw, a face shadowed by the brim of a battered hat. He carried whole winters in his eyes. The murmuring from the crowd faltered as he approached, his presence a stone dropped into their shallow pond of gossip. He stopped not before the crowd, but before the path leading to Lena's porch. He lifted his head then, and his gaze passed over the onlookers without interest, settling finally on the notice tacked to the post. He read it, his expression unmoving. Then he looked at Lena. For the first time all day she met someone's eyes. They were not cruel, or pitying, or curious. They were just still. Like deep water. He saw the woman, not the spectacle. He saw the straightness of her spine, the bleached white of her knuckles. He saw the anchor stone she had chosen in the path. He turned his gaze to Silas Blackwood. The silence stretched, thin and tight as a wire. The wind died down as if the land itself was holding its breath. Blackwood, the stranger's voice was low, rough with disuse, a sound that seemed to come from under floorboards. Silas pushed himself off his horse, a smirk playing on his lips. You lost, friend? The stranger paid the question no mind. He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and pulled out a folded, sweat-stained letter and a small, heavy-looking leather pouch. He did not look at Lena again. His focus was entirely on the man who had put her on display. I had a contract with Samuel Parker, the stranger said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Silas's smirk faltered. Parker's dead. The contract ain't, the stranger replied. He tossed the pouch onto the ground between them. It landed with a solid, definitive chink of coin. That clears the debt on the notice. Silas stared at the pouch as if it were a snake. He looked from the coins to the stranger, then to Lena, his face darkening with thwarted pride. The crowd shifted, their amusement souring into confusion. This was not part of the show. The stranger, Elias, did not wait for an answer. He walked past Silas, up the 3 short steps of the porch. He did not look at Lena, did not acknowledge her presence beside him. He simply reached up with one raw-boned hand and ripped the foreclosure notice from the post. The nail screeched in the dry wood. He held the paper in his hand for a moment, then crumpled it into a tight ball. He didn't throw it. He just held it. The act was quiet, final. He had not touched her, had not offered a single word of comfort, but he had untied her from the post as surely as if he had cut ropes from her wrists. He turned and with a small, almost imperceptible nod indicated the front door. An invitation for her to retreat. To go inside. Lena's breath returned to her in a ragged gasp. She looked at the splintered wood where the notice had been, then at the crumpled paper in the stranger's fist. She turned her back on the silent, gawking town and the furious face of Silas Blackwood, and she walked into the cool darkness of her house. He followed her in, closing the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place was a thunderclap in the sudden quiet. Outside, the world fell away. Inside, there was only the still, heavy air, thick with the scent of old wood, dried herbs, and the ghosts of 1,000 lonely meals. She stood in the middle of the main room, her arms wrapped around herself, trembling now that the performance was over. He remained by the door, a silhouette against the bright light, giving her space. The house was small, just this one main room with a fireplace, a table, and 2 chairs and 2 doors leading off to tiny bedrooms. It was clean, obsessively so, but worn down to the bone. The floorboards were scrubbed pale, the single quilt on her father's bed was patched in a dozen places. It was a house that was trying its best. He finally moved, his boots making a soft, scraping sound on the floor. He walked not towards her, but towards the water bucket by the hearth. He picked up the dipper, drank deeply, then set it back down with a quiet click. A simple act that staked no claim, made no demand. "There's a well out back," she said. Her own voice sounded foreign, thin as a fence rail. He nodded, not looking at her. "Pump needs a new washer." She stared at his back. He had been here less than 5 minutes and had already diagnosed a fault in the mechanics of her life. He unslung his bedroll and placed it on the floor near the hearth, as far from her bedroom door as the small space would allow. He was establishing the terms without a single negotiation. He would occupy the floor. He would take up little space. He would not be a threat. It was an unspoken contract, laid out in gestures. He was here to work. Nothing more. She watched him, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. Fear of Silas, fear of the coming winter, and now fear of the silent man who had bought her reprieve at an unknown cost. "Why?" she asked, the word a whisper. That was more than the notice called for. He turned his head slightly, his profile carved by the dim light from the window. "A debt," he said, and the single word was a door closing. He offered no more. That night, she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sound of a stranger breathing in her house. She expected to lie awake, rigid with terror, but exhaustion pulled her down like a stone. For the first time in months, she slept without dreaming of falling. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Elias rose before dawn, the soft scrape of his boots on the floorboards the only alarm she needed. He never lit a lamp, moving through the pre-dawn gloom as if he had memorized the space by touch alone. By the time she came out, he would be gone, already at work in the fields or mending the endless length of fence that sagged like a tired spine around the property. He left a full bucket of fresh water by the door for her each morning. It was a small thing, but the pump was stiff and her arms ached from wrestling with it. The gesture was silent, practical. It was his way of speaking. Section, she answered in kind. At midday, she would leave a plate on the porch rail, bread, a piece of cheese if she had it, some greens from her meager garden. She would go back inside, and from the window, she would watch him come, take the plate, and retreat to the shade of the lone cottonwood to eat. They never ate together. They orbited each other like 2 solitary planets, held in place by a gravity they did not understand. His work was a quiet, relentless force against the decay of the place. He reset the posts of the corral until they stood straight and true. He cleared the rock-choked north pasture, his back a long, hard line of effort from sunup to sundown. He moved with an economy of motion, wasting nothing, a man who knew that survival was measured in saved energy. He was stitching the ranch back together with raw thread and sweat. Lena, in turn, poured her own energy into the house. She swept the floors until they shone, mended his worn shirt while he slept, leaving it folded on his bedroll. She coaxed the garden into yielding a few more pale vegetables. The work was an anesthetic, a way to keep from thinking about the future or the past. Their shared labor was a conversation, the only one they seemed capable of having. One afternoon, she was clearing the weeds from the small, fenced-off plot behind the house. 2 graves lay there, marked by simple wooden crosses. Her mother, taken by a fever long ago. Her father, taken by a broken heart and a harsh winter just last year. She knelt and pulled a stubborn thistle from the base of his cross, her fingers raw. As she worked, she saw Elias standing at the far end of the fence line, watching her. He did not approach. He just stood there, his hat in his hands, a silent witness. When she looked up again, he was gone, but later that evening she found a single, tough prairie wildflower, its stem tucked into the handle of the water bucket. A flash of startling, deep blue against the weathered gray wood. She took the flower inside and put it in a glass of water on the windowsill. It felt like an extravagance. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the heavy, brittle silence of strangers. It had become a shared space, a comfortable quiet that did not demand to be filled. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit on the porch steps and whittle at a piece of scrap wood, the knife moving with hypnotic grace. She would sit in the doorway, shelling peas or mending, and they would exist in that twilight space together, the scrape of his knife and the rustle of her work the only sounds. One night, a storm blew in from the west, the sky turning a bruised purple. The wind howled, rattling the window panes like angry ghosts. Lena lay in her bed, the sound of the wind dredging up memories of the night her father had died, the sound of his last, rattling breaths echoing the fury outside. A cold panic seized her, sharp and suffocating. She couldn't breathe. The room felt like a coffin. She threw back the covers and fled to the main room, her heart hammering against her ribs. Elias was already awake, sitting on his bedroll in the dark, watching the storm through the window. He did not seem startled to see her. He simply looked at her wild eyes and her trembling hands. Without a word, he rose and went to the hearth. He laid a fire with practiced hands, and soon, a small, brave flame pushed back the shadows. The crackle of the wood was a comforting counterpoint to the raging wind. He gestured to the floor on the other side of the hearth. She sank down onto the worn rug, pulling her thin shawl around her shoulders. They sat there for a long time watching the fire dance. The house groaned under the assault of the wind, but inside, the small circle of light felt like a fortress. The roof held, he said, his voice low. Yes, she whispered. The firelight carved deep shadows on his face, softening the harsh lines. She could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the deep groove of some old pain. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than gratitude or fear. It was curiosity. A need to understand the man who had appeared out of the dust and quietly rebuilt her world. Why did you come? She asked, the question rising unbidden from the depths of her fear. The truth. He stared into the flames, his hands resting on his knees. The silence stretched, filled only by the storm and the fire. She thought he would not answer. Your father, he began, his voice rough. He found me on the plains south of the Cimarron. My horse was dead. I was close to it. He paused, the memory clinging to him. He gave me his water. Half a loaf of bread. Sat with me until the fever broke. He saved my life. Lena stared at him, trying to picture her quiet, gentle father as a savior on the plains. I told him I'd repay the debt, Elias continued. He asked for nothing. Said a man just helps another man. But I gave him my word. Told him if he ever needed anything, he could send for me. He finally looked at her, his eyes reflecting the fire. The letter I had, it was from him. He sent it before the winter. He wrote about the ranch. He wrote about you. The secret was not a shocking twist. It was something far more profound. It was a promise. A debt of honor. He was not a hired hand, not a drifter who had stumbled into her life by chance. He was the answer to a dying man's last hope. He was worried, Elias said quietly. About you being alone. Tears she had refused to shed under the scornful eyes of the town now welled up, hot and silent. She didn't weep for her loss, but for the fierce, desperate love of the father who had tried to protect her even from beyond the grave. And for the quiet integrity of the man who sat before her, a man who valued a promise more than his own life. She didn't say thank you. The words felt too small, too hollow. Instead, she just nodded, pulling the shawl tighter. The fire crackled. The storm raged outside. But inside the small house, something had shifted. A foundation of trust, laid stone by silent stone, had finally settled. The peace, like the prairie grass, was a fragile thing. For weeks, the rhythm of their shared life held steady. The corn grew a hesitant green against the brown earth. The fences stood tall. The house felt less like a shell and more like a home. But the shadow of Silas Blackwood was long, and it stretched all the way from town. The first sign was subtle. A length of newly mended fence cut clean through, the wire curled back like a sneer. Elias found it at dawn, his jaw tight. He said nothing of it to Lena, simply spent the morning repairing the damage, his movements tight with a controlled anger. A few days later, the water from the well came up cloudy, tainted with the bitter taste of alkali. Someone had fouled it in the night. They were forced to haul water from the creek, a backbreaking task that ate into the precious daylight. Still, Elias did not speak of the malice behind it. He just worked harder, his silence growing deeper, more watchful. Lena felt the change in him. He no longer sat on the porch in the evenings. Instead, he would walk the perimeter of the ranch, a dark shape moving against the twilight, his eyes scanning the horizon. The easy quiet between them was replaced by a tense, waiting silence. The land was no longer a place of healing, it was a border they had to defend. The harbinger came not as a rider, but as a flicker of orange against the dark hills to the north. A fire. It was too far to be a direct threat to the house, but the message was clear. It was Blackwood's hay field, set ablaze. A warning shot. A demonstration of power and carelessness. I can burn what is mine. I can burn what is yours. The confrontation, when it came, was not in the dead of night, but in the bold, unforgiving light of midday. Lena was weeding the garden, her back to the road, when the sound of multiple horses made her stand up, her hand shielding her eyes. Silas Blackwood was there, astride his fine black horse, flanked by the 2 Miller boys and 2 other men she didn't recognize, hired muscle with dull, indifferent eyes. They reined in at the edge of her garden, trampling the new squash vines under their hooves. Elias emerged from the barn, holding a harness he'd been mending. He moved without hurry, placing himself between Lena and the riders. He didn't look back at her, but she felt the solid wall of his presence. Blackwood, Elias said. His voice was flat, calm. This is private property. Silas laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. Everything in this valley is my property, one way or another, drifter. I just came to make you an offer. A man like you could have a steady wage. Good work. No need to waste your sweat on this dried-up husk of a place. He gestured vaguely towards the house, towards Lena. His eyes dismissed her as if she were just another fixture of the failing ranch. I have work, Elias said. Silas's smile vanished. His gaze hardened. This isn't about work. This is about what's mine. Parker owed me more than just money. This land was promised. You're trespassing on my future. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a confidential, contemptuous tone. And for what? That woman? Her father's last mistake was thinking this place had a chance. His second was hiring you. Lena felt the words like a slap. All the old shame, the public humiliation, coiled in her stomach. She had an urge to run, to hide in the house and let Elias handle the ugliness. It was the man's world, the man's fight. That was the way of things. But as she looked at Elias's unyielding back, at the quiet, resolute line of his shoulders, something shifted inside her. He had not fought for the land. He had fought for a promise. He had not rescued a damsel. He had honored a debt to her father. And in doing so, he had shown her a respect no one else ever had. He had treated her not as an object to be pitted or claimed, but as the silent, breathing center of that promise. He had been guarding her honor, not just the property lines. She took a step forward, then another, until she stood beside him. The earth was solid beneath her worn shoes. She could smell the dust, the sweat of the horses, the sharp, clean scent of the man next to her. Elias glanced at her for a fraction of a second, his eyes telling her to go back. But he did not say it. He did not command her. He let her make her own choice. Silas's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in a smirk. He thought her a fool for stepping into the line of fire. He addressed her directly, his voice oozing a false pity. Lena, your father was a good man, but a poor businessman. Don't you make the same mistake. This man can't protect you from the inevitable. The trembling that had lived in her hands for a year was gone. Her voice, when it came, was not the thin whisper he would have remembered. It was low, steady, and clear. It carried across the yard. My father's last gift, she said, her eyes locked on Silas, was a man of his word. The words hung in the air, a stunning, unexpected defiance. Silas's face contorted with rage. It was one thing to be thwarted by a silent drifter, it was another to be defied by the very woman he considered a part of the spoils. He swung down from his horse, his intentions ugly and clear. You need to be taught a lesson about gratitude. He took a step toward her. Elias moved, not with a burst of speed, but with a deep, grounding shift of weight. He dropped the harness and his hand fell to a heavy fence post he had been meaning to set, lifting it from the ground. He held it loosely at his side. It was not a weapon brandished, but a statement of immovable reality. He was not going to move. "That's far enough, Silas," Elias said, his voice still quiet, but now it held the cold, hard edge of forged steel. Blackwood froze, his eyes flicking from Elias's calm face to the timber in his hand to the woman standing unbowed beside him. He saw not two separate, broken people, but a single, unified front. He had come expecting to scatter them like quail, but he had found a wall. From the road, another sound. A wagon. It was Mr. Henderson, their nearest neighbor, a man who had offered condolences but no help after her father's death. He pulled his team to a halt, his face grim as he took in the scene. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, watching. His presence was a quiet vote. Silas looked from Elias and Lena to the silent witness on the road. The Miller boys shifted uneasily on their horses. The fight had gone out of them. A bully needs an approving audience, or at least a silent one. A disapproving one took the sport out of it. With a curse, Silas spat on the ground, inches from Lena's feet. He turned without another word, swung himself back onto his horse, and tore away, his men scrambling to follow, leaving a cloud of bitter dust in their wake. The dust settled. The yard was quiet again, the only sound the buzz of insects and the soft stamp of Henderson's horses. Elias slowly lowered the fence post, setting it carefully on the ground. He looked at Lena, his face unreadable, but his eyes held a deep, quiet light. A question and an answer all in one. "You didn't run." She just met his gaze, her heart a steady, even drum against her ribs. She had not run. Mr. Henderson finally clucked to his team and drove on, tipping his hat as he passed. It was a gesture of respect. Something had been settled in the valley that day. That evening, the silence in the house was different again. It was deep and peaceful, the quiet of a harbor after a storm. After their sparse meal, Lena went to his bedroll by the hearth. She picked it up. Elias watched her, his expression questioning. She said nothing. She walked to the second bedroom, her mother's old room, which had stood empty and closed for years. She pushed open the door and entered the small, shadowed space. She placed his bedroll neatly on the narrow cot within. It was not a declaration. It was not a proposal. It was an invitation. An acknowledgement. "You are not a guest here. You are not a hired hand on the floor. This is your home, too." She had given him a room. She had given him a place. The first good rain came a week later, a slow, soaking baptism that washed the dust from the world and turned the air clean and sweet. It drummed on the roof of the house, a sound not of threat but of promise. Lena stood on the porch, holding her hand out to the downpour, feeling the cool drops on her skin. It felt like a forgiveness. Elias came to stand beside her, and for a long while they just watched the parched earth drink. The land that had been their adversary was now sighing in relief. When the rain finally softened to a drizzle, he went to the hearth and taking the crumpled, year-old foreclosure notice from the mantel where he'd kept it, he dropped it into the flames. They watched it curl, blacken, and turn to ash. A fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. With the threat of Silas Blackwood faded to a bitter memory, the rhythm of their life found a new, deeper cadence. They were no longer just surviving, they were building. Together, they turned the soil in the north pasture, the one he had cleared of stones. They planted winter wheat, a shared act of faith against the coming cold. His hands and hers in the same dark earth. One afternoon, he found her by her father's grave. She had weeded it clean and planted the single blue wildflower from the windowsill at the base of the cross. It looked small but impossibly resilient. He stood beside her, not crowding her, his hands clasped behind his back. "He would be proud of you, Lena," he said, using her name. It sounded different now. Not just a label, but a name he had earned the right to speak. "He would be grateful to you," she replied, her voice soft. He shook his head slightly. "The debt is paid." This he made a vague gesture that encompassed the wheat field, the standing fences, the solid little house. "This is something else." She knew what he meant. The contract was fulfilled. The promise kept. What they were building now was not born of obligation. It was born of the quiet space they had cultivated between them, a space made of shared work, mutual respect, and unspoken kindness. Months passed. The autumn air grew crisp and the wheat stood tall, a sea of pale gold. The harvest was small, but it was theirs and it was enough. The house felt solid around them, its rooms breathing with their shared life. The evenings were their time. They sat on the porch steps as the sun bled out across the horizon in streaks of blood orange and lavender. The chill in the air was a good reason to sit a little closer. He would whittle, his knife turning a piece of cottonwood into something with shape and life. She would be mending, her needle dipping in and out of the cloth in a steady, calming rhythm. One such evening, he finished his carving. He held it in his palm for a moment, sanding a rough edge with his thumb, and then he held it out to her. It was a bird, its wings half spread as if caught in the moment just before flight. The detail was clumsy but heartfelt. She put down her sewing and took it from him. Her fingers brushed against his, calloused and warm. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a shock of heat through her. She looked at the small wooden bird in her hand, then up at him. His eyes held the deep, quiet light she had come to know. There was no demand in them, no expectation. Only a steady, unwavering presence. He had come into her life as a debt of honor to a dead man, a guardian for a piece of land. He had stayed, and in the silence and the hardship he had become something more. He had become her anchor. And she, who had been defined by her loss, by what she could not hold, had found a different kind of strength. Not the strength to stand alone, but the strength to stand with someone. She closed her hand around the small bird, its wooden form solid and real against her palm. She did not say thank you. She did not need to. She simply gave him a small, true smile, and in the fading light he smiled back. It was enough. It was everything. A story like this, it isn't just about a ranch saved or a debt paid. It's about the quiet language of healing, the one spoken not in words but in shared silence and a bucket of clean water left by the door. It's about how two solitudes, two people broken in their own ways, can learn to shelter one another, becoming a fortress built not of anger or defense, but of mutual respect. It's a story that reminds us that the strongest walls are not made of wood or stone. They are woven from the threads of unspoken kindness, of showing up when the world is loud and cruel. They are built from the simple, profound act of seeing another person's honor and choosing to stand guard over it. So look for the helpers, the quiet ones, the people who communicate through action and who understand that a promise is the heaviest and most sacred thing a person can carry. And if you're very brave, you might find you are one of them. You might discover that the most profound loves are not the ones that burn like a wildfire, but the ones that glow steady and warm like a hearth fire on a stormy night, a quiet testament to the simple, anchoring grace of a debt of honor.